Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao IAS Academy, the Hindu News Analysis. Today is 3rd January 2025. In today's discussion, we have some important news articles from the Hindu newspaper. And along with all these important news articles, we also have one mains practice question. So we'll try to understand what is the exact demand of the question, how can we structure the question, and also how can we improve the presentation as well so that we could score maximum marks in the mains examination. So without any further delay, let's get into the discussion and let's try to discuss all these important articles along with this mains practice question. So the question that you can see here, it is about the relationship between climate change and poverty. How climate change has been reinforcing poverty, or how climate change has been pushing more people into the chronic cycle of poverty. Now here you could see the question that while poverty eradication is crucial for human development, so there is no doubt that poverty eradication is very important for human development. And in fact, sustainable development goals also rightly recognized the need for eradication of poverty, and it plays a very important role in all-round human development. However, it often comes at the cost of increased greenhouse gas emissions. There is always, whenever countries tries to bring in policies, or countries tries to minimize the inequalities or minimize or eradicate poverty, so it often results in increased greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in this context, critically analyze this contrast and suggest strategies that can reconcile poverty reduction with climate mitigation efforts. Right, so I hope you have understood the question. Understand that any country which wanted to eradicate poverty, it is very important that that particular country should achieve a higher industrial growth and development, because industries could create more and more employment for the people, and more employment opportunities for the people means people could easily come out of this chronic cycle of poverty. But on the other hand, these industrial activities, particularly in the developing world or underdeveloped countries, so they use fossil fuels in their industrial activities, and fossil fuels would release in the greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact it would contributing to the climate change. So this is how there is a contradiction or a contrast between poverty eradication efforts and the greenhouse gases emissions. Now in this context, how we could actually reconcile poverty with the efforts to tackle climate change, and at the same time you should also mention some strategies to achieve the same. Right, so this is actually the demand of the question that is given here. And in fact, in the introduction, you could briefly describe this contrast or contradiction or the paradox that has been existing between the poverty reduction and also the need to tackle the greenhouse gas emissions, which are otherwise responsible for the climate change. Now, the paradox of the modern development lies in the tension between economic growth for poverty alleviation, right? So economic growth and development is very, very important for any country. So why it is very important? Because it could play a very important role in eradication or alleviation of poverty. And at the same time, economic growth should not result in a substantial environmental degradation. So therefore, in this context, we need to balance poverty eradication with climate goal. And in fact, it is considered as challenge of our century, because if you could see that majority of the poor population are living in the developing world or the underdeveloped countries. Now in this context, those countries do not have adequate finances and also technology. And because of that reason, they're not able to make a transition towards a green growth So green growth is very important for any country, right? So green growth ensures that country would not depend on fossil fuels for energy generation, for industrial activities, and at the same time green growth also gives rise to a gainful employment opportunities for the people. And gainful employment opportunities means that people would have adequate income, or otherwise it is called as income security, and it results not just income security but also it results in social security of the people. So income security and social security would result in reducing or eradication of the existing levels of poverty, and in fact it is recognized as one of the priority under sustainable development goal number 1, right? So growth should be sustainable, and along with sustainable growth, so we need to focus on balanced development. So balanced development is also a very important dimension that the modern world should emphasize on, particularly in the 21st century. So why we need to focus on balanced development? Because balanced development could address the twin goals of environmental sustainability. Along with environmental sustainability, it could also address the developmental needs of the communities, and because of that reason we need to adequately emphasize on balanced development. Now, in this context, how poverty eradication and greenhouse gas emissions are contradictory to each other? This is the first dimension that we need to talk about and we need to understand. So there's no doubt that economic growth of any country. Now India after 1991 economic reforms has been registering a decent amount of growth rate. And in fact, it is also believed that India is able to successfully bring around 150 million people out of poverty since then. 150 million people out of the chronic cycle of poverty since then, because of the economic growth that India has achieved consistently. So however, it is another thing that economic growth is not able to create adequate employment opportunities. Because of that reason, our growth is called as jobless growth. Because economic growth, even India being the fastest growing major economy in the world, India is not able to create adequate employment opportunities, and because of that reason India's growth is called as jobless growth. However, economic growth in any way is very important for the poverty reduction. However, economic growth or economic development of any country substantially relies on industrialization of that particular country, right? So we need to have a strong industrial presence in our respective economies, because industrialization would result in exports, industrialization would result in gainful employment opportunities for the people, and it would also result in the social security as well as income security that we have just discussed. So that's how we could bring people out of poverty. But on the other hand, imagine that the developing countries or underdeveloped countries, where they don't have the adequate capacities to switch over to renewable form of energy or switch over to more efficient technologies when it comes to usage of energy, so they still rely on the fossil fuels. However, fossil fuels are the major greenhouse gases. They release a lot of greenhouse gases, and that would result in the climate change. So I hope you have understood the paradox between the poverty eradication and greenhouse gas emissions. And secondly, we should also look into the consumption patterns of the economies as well. As poverty declines in any economy, there will be always increased consumption of energy intensive products. So energy intensive products in the sense that electronics, transportation, so they can also lead to the higher emissions. Now in India, imagine that poor cannot afford air conditioning. So it is true, poor cannot afford air conditioning. Now imagine that if they come out of the chronic cycle of poverty and now they are middle class and now they are earning a decent income, that means they have adequate income security as well as social security. So what they will do, they will install air conditioning, and that would be considered as energy intensive. But on the other hand, so how energy is produced? The majority of the energy is produced in India by the thermal power plants. Around 50% of the energy is produced from the thermal power plants, and in fact thermal power plants uses fossil fuel such as coal, and when you burn the coal, it also releases fossil fuels into the it also release greenhouse gases into the environment. So in that way also it has been contributing for the climate change. And apart from that, so excessive dependence on agriculture in these third world countries, particularly the underdeveloped countries and the developing countries, or it is also known as the global south. Now global south collectively comes, or collectively the African continent, Latin American continent, or Asian continent, particularly South Asia, Southeast Asia, is called as global south. And in majority of the countries in the global south, people still depend on the agriculture sector. And in fact, so agriculture sector is very often known for its unscientific practices of cultivation, particularly in the global south. So many of the global poor, they still depend on the agriculture sector, right? And in fact the agriculture sector is very often considered as climate sensitive as well as emission intensive sector, because agriculture sector releases greenhouse gases such as methane, and mechanization of the agriculture to some extent that could also releases emissions as well. So it is climate sensitive because agriculture plays a very important role in resources conservation or efficient utilization or sustainable utilization of existing resources, whether it is soil, whether it is water resources, or any other different form of resources. Because of that reason, agriculture is also considered as climate sensitive and emission incentive or intensive. And the other important factor that we need to understand, urbanization and infrastructure development is also another important factor that has been considered as a contradiction between poverty eradication and greenhouse gas emissions. Now whenever we wanted to eradicate poverty from our communities, from our societies, it is very important that we need to build resilient infrastructure, we need to build sustainable infrastructure, so that the sustainable infrastructure would yield the results, particularly when it comes to eradication of poverty. Now imagine how connectivity plays a very important role in improving the lives and living standards of the people who are living in remote areas or otherwise unconnected or underconnected areas. So last mile connectivity is also very important. It could improve their lives and living standards as well. However, such infrastructure projects are also result in emission of greenhouse gases due to the usage of cement, steel, and even the transportation sector. So transportation sector is also considered as emission intensive sector, and when you produce steel and cement, so in this process also they would release a huge amount of the greenhouse gases into the environment. So therefore you have understood the contradiction between poverty eradication and also the greenhouse gases. Now we'll try to understand certain challenges in aligning poverty reduction with climate change. So it is not always very easy to balance poverty eradication with the climate mitigation. So therefore now we'll look into this dimension as well, because this is also a very important dimension. Now remember, when you are writing an answer, it is very important that you should write or you should mention some examples as well along with these points. Now firstly, industrial dependency is one challenge that countries have been facing. Now because poverty alleviation often depends on emission heavy industries, or high emission intensity industries, particularly manufacturing and construction. And in fact, imagine that most of these industries are considered as labor intensive industries, but they are not the capital intensive industries, but also labor intensive industries, but they are less technology intensive industries, right? So since they are labor intensive industries and capital intensive industries, there is a potential of creating large scale employment opportunities. Again, large scale employment opportunities means social security and income security for the families. So therefore, whenever you wanted to eradicate poverty, you need to depend on industries, right? So industries are very often resulting in higher emissions into the environment, and that is one challenge that countries have been facing. And in fact, another important aspect is energy poverty. So we should also look into this dimension as well, because as of now many countries have been dependent on fossil fuels for energy generation, particularly coal, petroleum, diesel, or a crude oil, it is also called as. So when you depend on coal and when you burn the coal in thermal power plants, so they release a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that would result in global warming, and that's how it has been causing a lot of climate change. However, energy for any country is very important. Now every country has been trying to achieve energy security, but here the problem is that these countries do not have adequate finances, and they also lack the necessary technology. And finances and technology plays a very important role when it comes to ensuring energy efficiency. And along with energy efficiency, it is also very important that they need to switch over to the renewable energy, switch over to renewable form of energy. However, in order to switch over to energy efficient methods and switch over to renewable energy, they need finances and they also need technology. But on the other hand, the developed world is not ready to provide technology and finances to the developing countries to cope up with the climate change, particularly climate change adaptation and mitigation. So in this context, these countries are substantially dependent on coal for the generation of electricity, and coal would result in the emission of greenhouse gases as well. And this is another major challenge that countries have been facing. However, when we talk about one example of countries dependent on coal, is that still India's coal-based power plants, right? So around 50% of India's energy is generated from the thermal power plants alone, right? So therefore, it is very important that these countries need to switch over to renewable form of energy along with the energy efficient methods. And the other thing is that countries are as of now prioritizing immediate poverty alleviation, and when they are looking into the immediate poverty alleviation, they often overlook the long-term environmental impact, right? So there are a lot of countries which have been prioritizing the quick economic gains over the environmental sustainability, and that's where the mismatch between economic growth and economic development and environmental sustainability would takes place, and that would lead to the degradation of existing resources, or it would also resulting in unsustainable development, because it would result in emission of large scale greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And apart from that, most of the developing world has adopted the carbon intensive developmental models. Now, carbon intensive developmental models are considered as unsustainable because carbon emits a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, right? So they are heavily dependent on fossil fuels for their economic growth, and this is the case with most of the emerging countries in the world. For example, Indonesia has emphasized on rapid industrialization, and this rapid industrialization that took place in Indonesia successfully reduced poverty. But it is the largest coal exporter in the world. Now, on the other hand, coal is a fossil fuel, and when you burn the coal, it would release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that leads to the large carbon footprint in the environment, right? So, however, there are certain strategies that could be followed to reconcile poverty reduction and climate change. Now, what are the strategies that could be followed in this context, right? So, it is very important that we should understand the strategies that could be followed to reconcile poverty reduction along with the climate mitigation. So firstly, shifting towards low carbon economic activities is very important for any country or for any economy. Now when we talk about low carbon economic activities, particularly increasing our reliance on the renewable form of energies, right? So renewable energy is a very important in this context, right? So countries should invest in renewable energy generation. Along with renewable energy generation, energy efficiency is another way of investing or achieving the low carbon economic activity or switching over to the renewable form of energy. And apart from that, sustainable agriculture has to be focused on. So when we talk about the sustainable agriculture, so we need to talk about the climate resilient agriculture. It is very important, climate resilient agricultural practices. Now what are these climate resilient practices? Now agricultural practices which adequately adopted the changes that have been taking place in the climate regularly, and it is resilient to such changes, and agriculture is performing as robust as possible before the negative impact of the climate change as well. So therefore, in this context, when we talk about climate resilient agriculture, agroforestry comes under it, and even organic farming also part of it, and that could substantially improve the livelihoods without increasing the emissions. Now in this context, we could consider zero budget natural farming, or we could also consider the organic farming as well. However, in this context, there is a need for IEC, right? So IEC is very important. So IEC, so information, education and communication with the farmers is very important. That plays a significant role in substantially increasing the organic farming, and that is also in line with the climate resilient agricultural practices, because a substantial number of people are still dependent on the agriculture sector. And energy transition for the poor is also another very important area. So expanding access to renewable energy like solar energy, wind power for low income communities, so that can improve the living standards and even reduce the emissions as well. So in this context, the government has already launched PM Suryodaya Yojana, right? So Suryodaya Yojana, so that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has launched with the aim of providing solar rooftop solar energy equipment to around 1 crore villages, 1 crore households, so that their electricity bills can be reduced, or either zero electricity or their electricity bills can also be substantially reduced. And climate finance is also another very important area where developed countries could provide finances and technology to the developing countries and underdeveloped countries in their adaptation and mitigation efforts with respect to climate change. And we have a green climate fund, right? So green climate fund and global environment facility, so they need to play a very important role when it comes to financing climate change and climate change mitigation infrastructure development projects. And apart from that, the developed world should readily provide finances and technology to the developing world. And we should also talk about inclusive global policies. Now, inclusive global policies require international cooperation on equitable carbon budgets, because that could ensure poverty reduction, and that would also result in the mitigation of climate change and even achieving the climate targets as well in the long term. So however, to achieve this, we need to focus on balanced development, focusing on both environmental sustainability along with the sustainable level of economic growth and economic development. So that would make people come out of the chronic cycle of poverty, along with reducing the greenhouse gases into the environment. So I hope you have understood this, and now we'll discuss some important topics that are given in today's Hindu newspaper. The first topic is, recently the genetically modified crop related news is given in the newspaper, right? So it is also very often in news, so we'll try to understand about this. So there is a committee called Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, right? So genetic engineering appraisal committee is considered as an apex technical body in India, and it regulates genetically modified seeds, and introduction of genetically modified seeds or even import of genetically modified agricultural products would be regulated by the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. So we'll try to understand the context very briefly. The context is that Ministry of Environment and Forests and Climate Change has amended the rules which have been governing the selection of experts to the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. So what are the rules that the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change has brought in, and that has changed the selection of experts to the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee? Remember, this Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee is considered as the apex body or apex technical body which has been regulating the genetically modified seeds and their introduction in India. And in fact, the new rules that are being framed by the Environment Ministry actually require expert members in the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee to disclose any potential conflict of interest. For example, these expert members from any corporate company, any private corporate company which has been engaged in the manufacturing of these genetically modified seeds. So therefore, these new rules have mandated that if any expert member who is part of Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, so this expert member should disclose any potential conflict of interest, right? So if he discloses any potential conflict of interest beforehand, so his decisions would not be resulting in benefiting one particular stakeholder or one particular company, right? Because the conflict of interest may arise due to their professional affiliations with associations, or their own interests, or interests that they already engaged with some other companies or corporations. And apart from that, so this also include both direct association with any corporate company or any other association, or even the indirect associations as well, and in fact with matters which are being discussed by the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee meetings, right? So if they have any such affiliations with any associations before they become member of Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, so when they become expert member, when they start discussing about the introduction of genetically modified crops on a large scale, they would take decisions that would benefit one particular stakeholder. And because of that reason, these rules also include direct and indirect associations with matters discussed during the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee meetings. And apart from that, it is also felt that experts who are part of the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee, so they need to take necessary actions to ensure that these interests do not affect the committee's decisions. For example, if they have any such interests because of their engagement, either direct engagement and indirect engagement, so those interests should not affect the committee's overall decisions, and that is very important here. And if an expert has any direct or indirect connection with any company or any association, right? So pertaining to the matters which are discussed as part of the genetic engineering appraisal committee's meetings, so they should first disclose it before the meeting, right? So they should disclose that, okay, I have an association with this particular corporate company. So they should disclose this information before meeting takes place, unless committee specifically requests their participation, right? So committee specifically asks them to be part of this meeting. The expert is actually expected to recuse himself from the meeting. So that essentially means that the member who is associated with any other association or any other corporation or any other company before, so he should not take part in the meetings of genetic engineering appraisal committee to take a crucial decisions. Otherwise, the conflict of interest of that particular member would comes into play, and that would decides the decisions taken by the expert member. And in fact, all selected members of the genetic engineering appraisal committee, they are required to complete a form, and that particular form detailing their association or their professional affiliations with any other corporate company or any other association in last 10 years prior to the joining in the committee. And in fact, so why this measure has been taken, it is to ensure transparency as well as accountability in the working of genetic engineering appraisal committee, because this is a very important body and conflict of interest has no role in this body, in such an important body. However, the amendments are actually aligning with July 2023 Supreme Court's order, and July 2023 Supreme Court's order has mandated the central government to formulate a national policy on the genetically modified crops, right? So it has asked the central government to modify, Supreme Court has asked central government to formulate a national policy on genetically modified crops, and because of that reason, Union Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change has come up with such rules mandating that the expert members should readily disclose their conflict of interest or their association with any corporation. And now we'll understand what are the genetically modified crops. So it is very important for us to understand these genetically modified crops. Now, genetically modified crops, it is based on a technology that is called as genetic engineering, that is part of the biotechnology. And in fact, these are plants whose DNA has been either modified, altered, changed, or even removed using a technique called genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is a technology that can be used to change the DNA of plants, or alter the DNA of the plants, or remove the DNA of the plants, so the desirable traits can be acquired in those respective plants. For example, improving the nutritional content in some crop species, particularly rice and wheat, and even improving the taste in some fruits, or improving the shelf life in some fruits or in some foods. So that's how it is being done. So right, so a desirable traits can be achieved by the genetically modified crops, and these traits can actually enhance resistance to pests, diseases, herbicides, and they can also substantially improve the crop yields as well. However, when we talk about the genetically modified crops in India, so India as of now permits the import of GM soybean, genetically modified soybean, and also canola oil. So they are cooking oil, and in India GM soybean is not cultivated, as well as canola oil is also not produced in India. Rather, India has allowed the import of both GM soybean and canola oil because of the environmental concerns as well as concerns with respect to the human health as well. However, in India, BT cotton, which is also known as Bacillus thuringiensis cotton, is the only GM crop that is being approved for that is being approved for the cultivation in India, right? So it is being approved for the cultivation in India, Bacillus thuringiensis cotton. And apart from that, for other GM seeds, India had maintained a stringent regulations until recent developments, right? So India also maintained a very stringent regulations. That means because of the concerns with respect to GM crops and their introduction, so India as of now has not allowed the large scale cultivation of food crops with respect to genetically modified crops. And we need to understand certain advantages and disadvantages with respect to the genetically modified crops. Now, genetic modification is one of the best methods to develop pest-resistant crops, drought-resistant or drought-tolerant crops, because it would result in the faster, achieving the desired traits in certain crop species than the conventional breeding processes. And this is the other major advantage with the genetically modified crops. And apart from that, virus resistant trait is also another very important trait. And a virus resistant traits that can be introduced into the vulnerable plants that lack natural resistance. So with this, what happens, farmers can use a lesser amount of pesticides if the crops are naturally resistant to such viruses through the genetic engineering method. And even plants can be modified to express tolerance to drought, hence it reduces the use of groundwater as well, right? So in fact, in India, agriculture is considered as water intensive, and farmers also very often use unscientific irrigation methods, and that has been resulting in the exploitation of the groundwater resources on a very large scale. And even with respect to exploitation of groundwater resources, it would further resulting in water stress or water scarcity. So this genetic engineering, particularly introduction of GM crops in this context, will play a very important role in the consumption of excess water resources. And even genetically modified crops can enable farmers to use more sustainable agricultural practices such as no-till farming, which can keep carbon within the soil rather than in the atmosphere. However, the genetically modified crops are not without disadvantages. So there are certain disadvantages as well. So what are those disadvantages? So horizontal gene transfer of pesticide, herbicide or antibiotic resistance to other organisms, so that would put not only humans at risk, but it would also cause ecological imbalances by causing the spread of diseases among both plants as well as animals. And apart from that, pests may acquire resistance to pest resistant traits such as Bt toxin, which is being produced by the genetically modified crop, and that could further overcome the efficacy in these respective crops. And it is also felt that introduction of genetically modified crops would also further resulting in the reduction of genetic diversity in the neighboring crops, and genetic diversity is very, very important. So therefore, these are some of the disadvantages because of the introduction of the genetically modified crop species or plant species. Now, another important thing that we need to discuss is recently scientists have developed the injectable hydrogel cancer treatment, right? So they have developed the injectable hydrogel specifically for the cancer treatment. So we'll try to understand about this as well. So in a significant breakthrough in cancer therapy, researchers from Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Guwahati, and even in collaboration with Bose Institute, that is in Kolkata, so they have developed a revolutionary injectable hydrogel. And this revolutionary injectable hydrogel is designed to deliver anti-cancer drugs directly to tumor sites, right? Now, whenever any individual is suffering with the problem of cancer, so there will be an exponential growth of the cancer cells, and that would result in creation of tumors. However, the hydrogel would act directly on these tumors, so thereby it offers a safer and more effective alternative to existing traditional chemotherapy and surgery. So generally what happens with the traditional methods such as chemotherapy, whenever the chemotherapy is given to the patient, the healthy tissues of the patient would also gets impacted by this. So therefore it offers a healthy alternative where it will not harm the healthy tissues, rather it would only focuses on the tumors which are infected or which are containing the cancer cells. Now we'll understand what are the key features of the hydrogel. So hydrogel has certain key features. So in fact it acts as a stable reservoir for anti-cancer drugs, and in fact it contains anti-cancer drugs, and because of that reason it is considered as a stable reservoir, and it would result in a medication in a controlled manner while minimizing the damage to healthy tissues which is being caused by the traditional methods such as chemotherapy. And in fact the hydrogel treatment method for cancer cells, it is considered as a localized drug delivery system, right? So this is a localized drug delivery system, and this could address the limitations of the conventional cancer treatments such as chemotherapy and even the surgical interventions as well, because as I have already discussed that chemotherapy and other surgical interventions can even harm the healthy tissues, but it is not the case with the hydrogel. So thereby it offers a potential alternative to existing cancer treatments. These are also known as conventional cancer treatments, the most commonly used treatments. However, these hydrogels are based on water, and they are also a three-dimensional polymer networks, and they can absorb and even retain the fluids, and the unique structure mimics the living tissues, thereby making them ideal for biomedical applications, right? So they have a lot of potential applications when it comes to the biomedics. And the hydrogel, which has been developed by the researchers from IIT Guwahati and Bose Institute, Kolkata, so they have composed of ultra short peptides, and these ultra short peptides are considered as biocompatible, and they are also considered as biodegradable as well, right? So these are the key features of the hydrogel. So however, so how they usually work, so what is the mechanism of action in the hydrogels, so that is what we should understand as well. So what sets this hydrogel apart is its ability to respond to the elevated levels of glutathione. So what exactly is this glutathione? So glutathione is actually a molecule so that is abundant, so that is presented in a large scale in these tumor cells. However, hydrogel effectively respond to the increased levels of glutathione, and that is present in these tumor cells. So when hydrogel encounter these elevated levels of glutathione, so it could trigger a controlled release of anti-cancer drug. So it starts releasing the anti-cancer drug directly into the tumor. And in fact, this mechanism of hydrogel releasing the anti-cancer drug in a controlled manner significantly reduces the side effects which are being associated with the chemotherapy, and that can impact the healthy tissues throughout the body. So this chemotherapy, as we have already discussed, that could impact the healthy tissues throughout the body, but this is not the case with the hydrogel technology that has been developed by the Indian researchers, right? So the next topic is poor state of infrastructure in Indian schools. Now when we talk about the infrastructure, schools having toilets, schools having drinking water facilities, electricity, playgrounds, computers, so these are all part of the infrastructure that schools actually have. Now we could say that schools have been transforming in India. So sort of transforming in the sense that now schools have digital boards itself in many states. So therefore, a report which has been recently published has been showing us that still there is a lack of substantial infrastructure in Indian schools. So the Union Education Ministry's data has recently revealed that many schools in India still lack important infrastructure and facilities, and that has been impacting the overall education quality. And so if you look at the data with respect to access to education or infrastructure or the poor state of infrastructure in Indian schools, so only 57.2% of the schools have functional computers, and 53.9% of the schools across the country have the internet. So that has been indicating that so many schools in India still lack access to these digital tools, and in fact these digital tools play a very important role in bridging the digital divide between urban and rural areas, between male and female students. So for modern education also the digital tools are very, very important, and in fact 90% of the schools as of now is having access to electricity, and even they are having gender specific toilets. So they are having access to gender specific toilets as well as having access to electricity. So however, when we talk about the student enrollment into the schools, the total enrollment decreased from 35 lakh. So there is around 35 lakh decrease in the gross enrollment ratio or student enrollment ratio, because in 22-23 25.17 crore students have enrolled. In 23-24 only 24.8 crore students have been enrolled. So what about this gross enrollment ratio? So when we talk about this gross enrollment ratio, that has shows the percentage of students who are enrolled at each education level, highlights disparities as well, right? So disparities in the sense that preparatory level or early level of education, 5% of the gross enrollment ratio, showing a good amount of enrollment. And dropout rates, the dropout rate has also significantly increased. So 2% dropout rate in the middle school and 9% of dropout rate in the secondary school. So this is the data that has been published by the Ministry of Education. However, we all knew that a new national education policy was released, or the government started implementing the new national education policy of 2020, and it aims to improve access to education, and it also aims to improve equity in education and quality as well. So access, equity and quality are the three essential aspects that the national policy on education has emphasized on. But infrastructure gaps still prevalent, right? So infrastructure gaps are still existing. So therefore, infrastructure gaps such as lack of access to digital tools and accessibility features remain the major challenges in the education system. Now, even the Education Ministry officials are highlighting the optimizing resources and addressing these infrastructure gaps. It is crucial to meet the educational targets of 2030. Now, in this context, the government has launched some programs or some schemes to ensure access, equality, equity, and even quality of education, particularly Prime Minister E-Vidya scheme, Diksha scheme, National E-Library, Swayam Prabha, Swayam Vidyadan, E-Pathshala, Smart India Hackathon. So those are some government initiatives. They primarily aimed at digital education and also bridging the digital divide. On the other hand, there are some government schemes particularly for the girls' education, improving their access, equity and quality. For example, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, Kasturba Gandhi Balika Vidyalaya, National Program for Education of Girls at Elementary Level, National Scheme of Incentives to Girls for Secondary Education, and even Pragati. So those schemes are also being launched by the government for education of the girl childs specifically, right? So